Hello and welcome. How hard is the US President Barack Obama finding it to shape a foreign policy in the harsh reality of the global political scene? Can good intentions be converted to realistic actions in places such as the Middle East? Well, during nearly 6 months in office, President Obama has made several major foreign policy addresses in an effort to redefine America's relationship with the world. Reaching out to Muslims, he addressed past US policies, restated his desire for dialogue with Iran, and said that Israel must stop all settlement construction. Well, of course, the last few days have brought a series of significant developments in that region, including an unprecedented voter turnout in Iran, followed by massive protests questioning the national election results. And on Sunday, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu gave a much-anticipated speech on the peace process, where he recognized for the first time the possibility of a demilitarized Palestinian state. But missing from his remarks was any commitment to halt settlement construction. So where does this leave President Obama's foreign policy? On today's show, we look at Iran's political scene and the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and ask, is President Obama on the right track or traveling down a road to nowhere? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE and enter the chat room and then take part. And we also welcome your phone calls on the show. Joining me now from Washington, D.C. to discuss President Obama's foreign policy is the former U.S. Undersecretary of State Nicholas Burns. During his 27 years as a career diplomat, Ambassador Burns served as the American representative to NATO, as State Department spokesperson, and led negotiations with Iran, India, and Kosovo. As America's top career diplomat in the Bush administration, he became one of Condoleezza Rice's closest advisors. He's currently a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Ambassador Nicholas Burns, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Riz.
So good to have you with us. Now, there are some amazing and unexpected pictures coming out of Iran following those elections. What do you make of those, and to what degree has the outcome of that election dampened any prospect for America to perhaps find a path for engagement with Iran?
Well, I think we're witnessing, Riz, an extraordinary situation in Iran. If you look at the images coming across the television screen and see the enormous number of people who went into the streets in Tehran on Monday, there's clearly lots of emotion and lots of unhappiness among many Iranians about the perception that the elections held last week were not free and were not fair. There are too many questions that have been raised by these elections, specifically Ahmadinejad's vote totals compared to how he has done in the past and how reformers has done in the past. So I think we'll just have to wait and see how the situation develops. It was significant today that the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei decided that the Guardian Council would review the complaints lodged by Mr. Mousavi, the reform candidate, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in Iran. As for the United States, I'm now out of government, but I do think that the Obama administration has been right to comment very little. They've registered their disappointment. They've certainly, as other governments have done in the Arab world and Europe, cast a little bit of doubt on how free these elections were. But I think the Obama administration has been right not to be too forward-leaning and not to say too much, because it wouldn't want to give President Ahmadinejad a chance to assert that the United States is somehow interfering in this in the aftermath of the vote in Iran. And so we'll have to see how the situation develops, but certainly there's reason for anyone who cares for the reform movement in Iran and wishes the Iranians to be as free as possible. It's certainly disappointing to see how the government handled this election.
Now, Ambassador, many felt that the Bush administration kept Iran hanging out there as a visible threat, perhaps an exaggerated threat, in order to be able to provide resources and certainly funding to America's military and intelligence. And I wonder if that's the case, to what extent it's backfired now and created a much bigger gap for President Obama to have to fill. And in your opinion, how realistic is the threat of Iran to the U.S.?
Well, I think that there is a very strong threat by Iran to the Arab world, specifically to the Gulf states, as well as to the United States, Europe, and other countries. The threat is twofold. First, there really isn't any doubt, and no one around the world does doubt it, that the Iranian government is seeking a nuclear weapons capability. They have been sanctioned 3 times by the United Nations Security Council. China and Russia have voted for those sanctions. They've been sanctioned by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And so I think that's the first threat, the threat that Iran might become in the future a nuclear weapons power, which is not in the interest of the Arab world. And obviously one hears that repeatedly from friends in the Arab world. And secondly, there is a threat from Iran's support for terrorism, for some of the Shia militant groups in Iraq, for Hezbollah and for Hamas against the moderate Palestinians, against the Lebanese government. Those are two specific threats that really can't be discounted. As for the Bush administration, I was a career diplomat serving in the Bush administration. I think over the last 4 years, the second term of President Bush, there was a real attempt made to try to negotiate with the Iranian government. It was the first serious attempt made by the United States in many, many years. We made it in conjunction with Russia, China, Britain, France, and Germany, the P5 countries in Germany. We offered on June 1st, 2006 to negotiate with the Iranian government. President Putin and others supported that, and the Iranian government turned us all down repeatedly between 2006 and 2008. So I actually think that the Iranians made a mistake in not agreeing to negotiations with the representatives of the United Nations Security Council back 3 years ago. I think the situation might have been better had the Iranians decided to negotiate, but they refused it. And so I do think that President Obama now has been right to say that there ought to be negotiations. I only hope the Iranians will reciprocate.
But I mean, Ambassador, is it possible that Iran didn't see the U.S. as an honest broker in those offers of negotiations, considering news coming out of the U.S. that the Vice President, for example, Dick Cheney, had a mission to try to provoke Iran into some kind of action and provoke it in such a way that perhaps the U.S. would have an excuse to provide military retaliation?
Well, look, there's been distrust between the United States and Iran for 30 years. We've had a frozen relationship. We don't have diplomatic relations. We don't have many American journalists or business people in Iran. The same is true of Iranians here. And there was a coherent, very decided attempt made by the international community, including the U.S., to reach out to the Iranians. I wouldn't blame the United States for that. I think the onus really has to be on Iran. And I think also, Riz, it's important to point out that the concern about a more powerful Iran is as deeply felt in the Arab world as it is in the United States or Britain or France or Germany. I hear as a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School continuously from friends and colleagues in the Arab world about their deep concern that Iran has violated the UN Security Council resolutions and that Iran is busy interfering in the affairs of Lebanon and certainly of Iraq. And so I wouldn't list this as just an American concern. I actually think it's quite universal.
Ambassador, we have a call on the line from London. Anwar is with us. Anwar, what would you like to ask?
Oh, hi, good evening, Rez and Mr. Burns. I just have two very simple questions. Obama's administration, very new in the United States. Can you honestly tell me that what has happened in Iran today is not Bush's policy, because they wanted to, obviously, they wanted to interfere in the elections? So that is one question. Secondly, tell me, is APEC more stronger in Washington or the White House is more stronger? Because at the moment it looks Netanyahu is challenging Obama, not listening to his suggestions for a peaceful solution for Palestinians.
Okay. Anwar, thank you. Let's, while we're here, before you get to answer, Ambassador, let's get Mahmoud also on the UK to see if there's any similarity in the questions. Mohammed, go ahead.
My question to him is that the Americans haven't got any friend in the world. The only friend they have, they use them and then they drop them and they leave them and the destruction of their country, like they use Pakistan. And Pakistan fought for the Western world against Russia in the late 80s. And now America used again. Now look, the Americans and the Western country intelligence service, they're using for Pakistan to dismantling that country, because that is nuclear state.
Mohammed, I'm going to get to the Ambassador. Ambassador, I guess listening to these two questions, first of all, it's the issue of U.S. credibility, and I know you've talked about this in your testimony to the Senate, that the credibility of the U.S. has taken a beating in recent years, and there is the need to build it up. On the issue of, for example, of Anwar's question of the legacy, the Bush legacy, leaving a difficult position for President Obama when it comes to Iran, what's your view on that?
I actually think that there's some similarities in the approach by the two administrations, President Bush and President Obama, towards Iran. Both administrations have favored negotiations with Iran. Both have reached out to try to convince the Iranians to meet us at the negotiating table. President Obama is willing to meet without conditions, which I think is appropriate and the right step forward. I'd also say that, you know, President Obama has made a concerted attempt to reach out to the Arab world and the Muslim world, most notably the speech that he gave just recently in Cairo, but also even beginning with his inaugural address back on January 20th. He's been very forthcoming. I think he's uniquely situated, given his own background and his family background, to be credible to the Arab and Muslim world, and I think he has been. As to the question from Mohammed about America's lack of reliability in the world, I would say this. America has the greatest collection of friends in the world. You know, we have 28 allies in the NATO alliance. We have allies in Asia and the Pacific, in Japan and South Korea, and in Australia. We have a very close relationship with India, a very good working relationship with China, and of course lots of friends and partners in the Arab world, as well as Israel. And so I just would respectfully disagree fundamentally with the way he put things, and say that I think that despite our imperfections, the United States has been a very good friend to our allies and partners over the years, particularly Pakistan. The United States now is considering a huge economic assistance program to the Pakistani government. We have been fundamentally behind them in their attempt to try to defeat the terrorist groups on Pakistani soil. And so I would say America has been a good friend to Pakistan.
Okay. Ambassador, we're going to take a very short break here. Don't go away. As we pause, we remind you, you can join the conversation with your questions and comments. Just log on to livestation.com, enter the chat room. There's a debate taking place in there right now, as you'll see. And we'll be right back.